Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs and Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Ambassador Dobriansky is a renowned expert in international affairs with extensive experience in global democracy, human rights, and national security issues. Having served as Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs and holding prominent roles in both the public and private sectors, she continues to be a leading voice on foreign policy today. We are honored to have Ambassador Dobriansky with us to discuss the challenges facing global governance and the importance of leadership in international relations. Ambassador Dobriansky, thank you for joining the Swift Hour.
I'm delighted to be here at the Swift Hour, and I'm also want to add something to that introduction. I'm also on the Leadership Council of Concordia.
That's right. We forgot the most important part. I want to talk first and foremost about your career. So much centered on world affairs, foreign policy. Who would you say was the most influential figure in your life that inspired that passion for foreign affairs?
Well, I think I'm going to mention two people and then a third person who I admire greatly. All right, the two people who really influenced me, my father and my mother. Both of them were educators. My father definitely influenced me because he was very active in the international affairs and in the global community. He believed strongly in universal freedom and also in terms of our heritage. I'm of Ukrainian descent, and my father believed strongly that Ukraine, as other countries in that neighborhood, needed to have their freedom preserved. And their freedom was taken away from them, as we know, certainly in the aftermath of World War II. My mother was also an educator, and she had a real influence and impact on me because she believed in public service. And she always instilled in her two daughters how crucial it was and is to go into government and to really make a difference. And by the way, I should add, not just only government. I mean, that's where I ended up. But she also felt that different types of associations, non-governmental organizations, that you should take on a role that can really improve the lives of others. And so both of them had that impact. But the other individual that readily comes to my mind is Ronald Reagan. And I had the privilege at age 24 of serving in the White House's National Security Council in the Reagan administration. And to me, it was extremely inspiring for the very reasons I've just stated. Reagan believed in universal freedom. He was someone who was determined to improve the lives of not only those in the United States and looking at our own welfare, but those of others.
Well, I want to talk about President Reagan in a minute because that was, you were 24 years old working for the National Security Council, but I want to dig a little bit more into your parents. Do you feel, because when I look at things today, there is a disconnect between the importance of foreign policy and how I think a lot of Americans think about elections and think about the issues facing their lives. Your parents had direct experiences that inspired that viewpoint. How does one navigate today explaining people who have not had those experiences why foreign policy should matter to them?
Well, you know, this is an interesting question. You know that here at Concordia, we had a debate the other evening at a dinner that I was at. I actually had cited and mentioned Karl Rove. I remember when Karl Rove came and met with a group of foreign policy types such as myself, he actually said, you know, the American public, they're never going to actually vote on foreign policy issues per se. The economy matters, health matters in terms of health care. There are certain issues which are going to be uppermost in the American public's mind, including, by the way, to define national security. If the security of the United States is threatened, that would, of course, be concerning. Issues of terrorism and how one deals with it. Immigration, we also know, is high on the list. But this is the part that I think I was, I wouldn't say corrected on, but others joined in and said, but wait a minute, there have been elections that have evolved around certain national security issues. And I thought back That's true. I think when actually Ronald Reagan came in, he came in because at the time, President Carter was the one who was dealing with the American hostage crisis in Iran. And it wasn't resolved. And Americans didn't like it. They did feel very connected to a foreign policy type issue where American lives were impacted. But I think the point is here when Rove said they're not going to vote on foreign policy issues, I think that's true in the sense that all foreign policy issues that are on the table are not the ones that are going to sway the public as to whether we should vote for this candidate over that candidate. Having said that, I think that it's an important piece, maybe because I'm a bit biased, but you asked the question, why are Americans not attuned to that? Well, I think it's a natural thing. Any country actually is going to look at the basics for one's family, one's livelihood, what are one's circumstances. So that's where the economy comes in, health comes in, education comes in, issues of immigration, of what impact immigration will have on your own community. So that term, America First, there's a lot to it because it's not just only America First, but other countries will look at those issues when they vote, first and foremost. Foreign policy does matter, but it's not at the top of the list.
We're watching, and this is where I want to bring up President Reagan, but also in a very interesting contrast to today. There's a significant difference in many elements of the Republican Party platform in foreign policy from the Reagan era to today.
That's true.
How do you see that evolution having taken place? What is your, how do you feel we as a country, the United States, is this a debate that we're having of really the role we want to play in this ever-changing global environment, or is this truly the kind of change that can have decades and decades of impact to American foreign policy?
Well, I see two things here. First, I went to Harvard University and I had the privilege of having Samuel Huntington as one of my professors. He wrote a book that dealt with American politics, and in it he put forth a framework of ideals versus institutions. And he said that we go through cycles in our politics over our history. By the way, we've had periods of isolationism, and then we've had periods where there's been intense engagement. And then it's gone back to this debate about a bit of isolationism, pulling back. So why? Huntington argued that the public gets impacted when it feels its institutions are not living up to its expectations. And I think that what we have witnessed in recent time actually was a bit of a disillusionment that our institutions are not exactly working for the public, not exactly addressing these issues. Why is the economy what it is? Why are we dealing and battling with immigration issues, etc.? So then there is this kind of pullback of let's improve our own problems first. We shouldn't be giving assistance here, there, if we're not addressing our own problems. Now, my own view, and this is the second part, I think we can do both, because also there are some misconceptions. Some of the public thinks that some 25% of our GDP is going towards humanitarian assistance or assistance abroad, aid and development abroad. Couldn't be further from the truth. It's less than 1%. In terms of our investment in our allies and alliances, that's in our interest. It's not just, oh, we're giving money away. No, it's in our interest because for our own protection here at home, you have to have partnerships with others who are of like mind, who are concerned about the same kinds of challenges and threats, and who are also investing their monies. And by the way, towards that end, during the Trump administration, there was a lot that was said about NATO and how he argued with other countries that are NATO members, they needed to up their defense spending. And by the way, Poland has 4.7% of their GDP going towards defense. Why? Because of the concern about what's happening in Ukraine and the fear of a future aggression. So my view is it has to be integrated, but you asked, what's the basis? I look back on what Huntington said. I think there's truth to that many Americans felt a bit disassociated. They didn't feel the The problems that concerned them were not being effectively addressed, and there was a turn inward.
So let's talk about the environment today we find ourselves in. Break down for me what you see as the current top 3 most significant national security threats to the United States.
Well, number 1 in my book is Russian aggression and what we've seen playing out in Ukraine. Why? It started back in 2007. Putin at the Munich Security Conference stated that if any Russian anywhere in the world is impacted, we have a right to go in, and Western values are not our values. Then what did we see after that? We saw aggression in Chechnya, we saw aggression in Georgia, and then aggression in Ukraine in 2014, and then aggression again, and in a very, very focused, targeted way. It's concerning. The countries surrounding Ukraine, like Poland, like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Finland, Sweden. If you had asked me, would I have ever expected Finland and Sweden to become members of NATO in my lifetime? No. Why? Because they're concerned about that threat. That threat also impacts us. We are not immune from any of this. Russia possesses nuclear weapons.
Would you like to see Ukraine accepted into NATO?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, I think that by Ukraine being brought into NATO, it will be one of the strongest deterrents against any future Russian aggression in not just only in Ukraine, but in that region.
Do you expect that to happen?
Unfortunately, that did not happen in the recent NATO summit in the United States, but I think that it will happen. The question, of course, is when. The second issue is the rise of China. China, very concerningly, is backing Russia in this aggression, and there's concern about what China will do vis-a-vis Taiwan. Xi Jinping has said very clearly his goals and objectives vis-a-vis Taiwan, and literally, undercutting Taiwan's freedom and independence. Why is this concerning? Let me cite the Japanese Prime Minister, Kishida. He's given 2 speeches in the United States. One was before our Congress, and one was before Johns Hopkins. In both, he mentioned, if Ukraine does not succeed in preserving its independence, we are gravely concerned about the ramifications for that playing out in Ukraine and the aggression by Russia, what that portends for the Indo-Pacific and what China will do vis-a-vis Taiwan. And I'm stating that because that's not our view only, but it's stated by a key leader in the region. There's great concern, and there's an interrelationship here between these 2 challenges that we are witnessing. The third, clearly, is the Middle East and what's happening in the Middle East. And here, I would say that I'm not only speaking about Gaza. Quite frankly, I would start with Iran. And the fact that Iran has supported terrorists, Hezbollah, Hamas, and in ways in which they are inciting violence and wreaking havoc throughout the Middle East, which is of grave concern to us.
You talk about Russia and its invasion of Ukraine as the number 1 threat. Your second threat is the rise of China.
Let me stop you, forgive me. All 3 are equal.
Equal. Okay, yes. That's an important clarification.
So you asked me the 3.
Yes.
They
all 3 are
have,
equal.
Yes, because they have different ramifications, but they're interconnected, and all of them impact the United States and our own security and that of our allies and partners.
No, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens over the next few years, and especially as a consequence of the U.S. election, what happens in the South China Sea.
May I share one thing with you? On June 5, that was of this year, it was the 20th anniversary, if you will, of the passing of Ronald Reagan. I felt very privileged to be invited out to the Reagan Library. And there was a discussion about, let's look at what Reagan had done when he was president. How can we transfer that to what we need now and what is important in addressing these global threats that, by the way, in some ways are unprecedented? Thinking about, we were concerned, of course, at the time of the height of the Cold War, but this is now threats in multiple multiple spheres, but they all have an impact on us. And one of the most important takeaways that at least I wanted to impart, and it even relates to your first question about how Americans vote and what's important and what can we do about it, and that is American leadership. We need to have American leadership. It's not just only the issue of looking at how global events impact us, but also it's important to have leadership at the top in the United States that will address domestic issues, but at the same time, simultaneously be leading internationally to stem the tide of those very harmful conflicts that are going to impact us. And in that sense, that's a skill, and I think Ronald Reagan really exemplified that. And I was very proud to be at the National Security Council at the White House during that time, because he was able to balance the domestic issues with the foreign policy issues. Not an easy thing to do.
And we will leave it there. Not an easy thing to do, but a lot happening on the world stage today. Ambassador Dobriansky, thank you so much for joining the Swift Hour.
And thank you. I've enjoyed tremendously being on the Swift Hour. Thank you for inviting me.